Welcome back to the deep dive. When we think about Halloween today, it's mostly costumes, candy, maybe worrying if you bought enough Snickers, right?
Right. It feels like this fixed commercial thing that's always been there.
But when you actually dig into the history, the sources we look at paint a really different picture.
Oh, absolutely. It turns out Halloween isn't just a holiday, it's more like a cultural canvas. And for 400 years, America has been projecting its biggest anxieties onto it political, religious, social, you name it.
That's the big aha moment, isn't it? The core idea we're tracking here is that fighting about Halloween, it's almost never really been about the ghosts and goblins.
No, it's always served as a kind of political proxy war.
So the way people oppose it keeps changing.
Exactly. The form is constantly shapeshifting. One minute it's a theological ban from the pulpit, the next it's city officials worried about vandalism, then it morphs into these huge moral panics.
But the underlying reason stays the same.
Pretty much. The fundamental function is constant. It's always about the dominant group, whoever that is at the time, trying to exert cultural control, trying to define what's acceptable, what's orderly, what's quote unquote American.
So the real monster isn't Dracula, it's whatever the establishment is most afraid of at that moment.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. And if you track how that opposition evolves, you actually get a kind of shortcut to understanding America's own changing moral landscape over the centuries.
Okay, so our mission in this deep dive is to trace that whole 400-year story. We'll look at it chronologically, and for each era, we want to nail down three things. The why, like what justification did opponents use? The how, what form did the opposition take? Was it a law, social pressure, something else? And the consequences, who actually got targeted or prosecuted because of it.
Sounds good.
Let's start right at the beginning, colonial era, because the opposition there was, well, about as extreme as it gets.
Right. To really get why the opposition was so fierce, you have to understand Puritan New England, specifically the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This was just fundamentally hostile ground for, well, pretty much any celebration that wasn't strictly religious or civic duty.
Yeah, our sources hammer this point home.
Yeah.
They call the opposition absolute and politically codified. This wasn't just like a suggestion from the minister.
No, this was a theopolitical state. Church and state were basically one and the same. They barely tolerated Christmas or Easter, saw them as popish, superstitious leftovers.
So what did they celebrate?
Well, the records show they focused on things like muster day, militia training election day, and the Harvard commencement.
Huh?
Seriously, anything that involved feasting, drinking, wassailing, or just general fun, that was seen as disruptive, a threat.
Okay, so they were against fun generally. But what were the specific arguments they used against something like All Hallows Eve, which is the root of Halloween? What was the intellectual justification for banning it?
It really breaks down into a dual justification, and you see echoes of this later on. First, and maybe the most powerful driver politically at the time, was intense anti Catholicism, anti papist feeling.
Because All Hallows Eve is the night before All Saints' Day.
Exactly. They saw it as a Catholic invention, one of those saints' days that the whole Protestant Reformation was trying to abolish. To them, celebrating a saint's day was inherently a great dishonor of God. It smacked of Rome, ritual, things they rejected.
Okay, so anti-Catholicism is number one. What else?
The second pillar was anti paganism. They argued these kinds of celebrations weren't biblical, that they came from loose pagan origins, basically idolatry. But here's the really clever part, the part that makes the Puritan model so lasting.
What's that?
They fused those religious arguments with a very practical one, anti disorder. They weren't just worried about theology, they were worried about social control. They wanted to stamp out the drinking and wassailing and the disruptive antics that often came with festivals.
Ah, so it's the classic combo. It's sinful and makes a mess.
Precisely. It's the spiritual moral argument, the dishonor of God, married perfectly to the civic public order argument, the offense of others, or just plain disorders. And that combination becomes the template for almost all future opposition.
But unlike, say, a modern debate on social media, the Puritans didn't just argue. They used the power of the state to prosecute people.
That's the crucial difference, yes. This wasn't theoretical. We have clear evidence of state-sanctioned prosecution, most famously through the 5 shilling fine.
I read that the law didn't actually mention Halloween by name because it wasn't a big thing yet.
Correct. The specific custom wasn't widespread among the English Puritans, but the law they passed in 1659, the penalty for keeping Christmas, was written broadly enough to cover it.
How did they do that?
The key phrase in the law banned observing Christmas or the like. And it specifically mentioned doing so by forbearing of labor, feasting, or any other way.
Or the like. That's a loophole.
It's the legal dragnet, yeah. All Hallows Eve, if anyone had tried to observe it with feasting or taking time off, would absolutely fall under or the like as another one of those superstitious festivals they hated.
So 5 shillings. Was that a big deal back then? Or just a slap on the wrist?
Oh, it was a very big deal. You have to think about the economy in the 1600s. A skilled worker might earn, what, maybe 1 or 2 shillings a day, maybe less for a farm laborer.
So 5 shillings could be several days' wages, maybe even a week's pay for some.
Easily.
Okay.
This wasn't pocket change, it was a significant financial penalty paid to the county. It shows just how serious the state was about controlling even private, religious, or festive observances. It was about enforcing conformity.
And we know they actually enforce this stuff, right? There's that anecdote.
Yes, the sources mention a man in Beverly, Massachusetts in 1662. He was actually taken to court specifically for hosting a drunken gathering on Christmas Day. So, yeah, the law had teeth. It was a political and economic tool to maintain the kind of society they wanted.
So, wrapping up the colonial era, the Puritans basically set the stage.
They really did. They established this foundational idea that the authorities, the state, had the right and even the duty to step into people's private lives to enforce a certain moral and civic order, using this blend of religious arguments about sin and practical arguments about disorder.
And that framework, that fusion, just keeps popping up again and again.
Every generation of opponents, whether they know it or not, is kind of drawing from that original Puritan playbook.
Okay, let's jump forward. We're past the Revolution, the Puritan bans are history. Halloween isn't really a major holiday in the US until the mid-19th century. What happens then?
Well, the big catalyst is immigration, specifically the massive wave of Irish and Scottish immigrants, especially after the potato famine hits Ireland in the 1840s.
And they brought their traditions with them.
Exactly. They brought the customs that we now think of as core Halloween traditions. Things like guising, which is basically dressing up in costumes, lighting bonfires, telling fortunes, and carving vegetables.
Originally turnips, right? Then they found pumpkins here.
That's right. Pumpkins were native and easier to carve. So these immigrant traditions start to take root, especially in the cities where they settled.
And this completely changes how people oppose the holiday, doesn't it? It's not about Puritan laws anymore.
Not at all. The opposition in the 19th century becomes deeply tied to nativist politics. You have this established Anglo-Protestant culture, particularly on the East Coast, seeing these new immigrants who were largely poor and Catholic flooding into the cities.
And they didn't like their traditions.
They saw Halloween customs as foreign, as papist, as potentially disruptive. There was already a huge amount of anti-Irish and anti-Catholic sentiment bubbling up in political movements of the time. Opposing Halloween became a way to express that.
So it wasn't a formal ban, but more social exclusion.
Precisely. It was a powerful tool of othering. Because the holiday was mostly celebrated in immigrant neighborhoods, often poorer areas, the dominant culture could just sort of dismiss it. They'd call it quaint, maybe, but basically frame it as something foreign, something those people do, not really American.
So the consequence shifted. It wasn't a fine anymore. It was being marginalized politically and socially, a
Right.
kind of softer persecution.
Right. But this era also planted a seed, something that would cause huge problems later, something our sources call an intellectual time bomb.
Okay, what was that?
It's the creation of the popular idea, which is still really widespread today, that Halloween is explicitly and directly descended from ancient Celtic pagan rituals, specifically a festival called Samhain.
That sounds like something historians would figure out. You're saying
All right,
it's flawed. The sources call it a 19th century myth.
Largely, yes. It wasn't so much discovered as it was constructed. Why folklorists and historians in the 19th century, particularly during the Romantic era?
What were they trying to do?
Well, these academics, often with a kind of nationalist agenda, were really keen to find pure ancient roots for modern folk customs in Europe. They wanted to trace everything back to some authentic origin.
So they looked at 19th century Irish peasants carving turnips and said, this must come directly from the ancient Druids.
Kind of, yeah. They were projecting ancient practices onto modern customs, making these direct linear connections that the actual historical or archaeological evidence didn't really support. They created this image of Samhain as this major pan-Celtic festival of the dead.
Which maybe wasn't quite accurate.
The evidence suggests it was more complex, maybe more regional, often tied to the agricultural calendar. But this romanticized, slightly spoopy version The idea that Halloween is basically just repackaged ancient paganism got written down in influential books.
And that's the time bomb.
That's the time bomb. This inaccurate, or at least overly simplified academic idea lies relatively dormant for decades. But then, fast forward to the 1970s and 80s, when certain religious groups are looking for reasons to condemn the holiday.
They find these 19th century books and say, see, proof, it's pagan, it's demonic.
Exactly. It provided the seemingly historical, intellectual justification they needed for the moral panics that followed. That flawed 19th century scholarship became the weaponized fact used in the 20th century.
Okay, so that brings us neatly to the turn of the 20th century, roughly 1890s into the 1920s. The immigrants who brought Halloween over are starting to assimilate. Cities are getting much bigger, much more crowded.
And the main complaint about Halloween shifts again, dramatically. It moves away from theology, away from blaming immigrants.
And becomes about sociology.
Exactly. This is when you start seeing the term the Halloween problem appear in newspapers and magazines. As the holiday spread out from those specific immigrant communities and into the wider urban American landscape, it became synonymous with, well, chaos.
Hooliganism, vandalism.
Oh, yeah. Major vandalism. We're talking about serious property damage. It wasn't just tipping over outhouses in the countryside anymore. In packed cities, the pranks escalated. Reports mentioned physical assaults, overt acts of violence, stuff got broken, windows smashed, fires set.
Costing cities real money.
Thousands and thousands of dollars every year in damages. It was a genuine civic headache.
So who were the main opponents now, if it wasn't primarily preachers or nativists?
The opposition shifts to civic leaders, mayors, police chiefs, city councils, and also social reformers. These are the key figures of the progressive era.
Right, the people focused on order, efficiency, cleaning up the cities, making society run smoothly.
Precisely. They weren't necessarily trying to abolish Halloween like the Puritans. Their goal was different. It was about control, domestication. How do we manage this problem?
So what was their progressive solution? If the problem was kids running wild and smashing things, how did they try to fix it politically or socially?
It was a multi-pronged approach. You see cities trying direct political action. Chicago is a good example. In 1926, officials tried this kind of social engineering thing, asking kids to take a pledge, a vow, not to cause destruction.
And the reward was?
Free movie tickets, trying to incentivize good behavior. Then, during World War II, you see it framed differently. In 1942, the Chicago City Council actually declared Halloween Conservation Day.
Conservation Day?
Yeah, linking it to the war effort. And they specifically ordered the police to safeguard property from pranksters and vandals. It was about protecting resources and maintaining order during wartime.
And this is also when businesses start getting involved in shaping the holiday.
Absolutely. This is crucial. Companies, especially ones like Dennison Manufacturing, they made paper goods, decorations, party supplies. They saw an opportunity. They started publishing these elaborate guides and catalogs promoting organized Halloween parties.
Held indoors, presumably.
Yes. Keep the kids off the streets. Bring the fun inside where it can be supervised. Dennison, and also the candy companies who were starting to see the potential, actively worked with the reformers to tame the holiday. They offered this commercialized, safer alternative, rebranded it as a wholesome diversion.
Okay, so parties help contain it indoors. But what about the street problem, the vandalism, the trick part of the equation? Was there a specific political or social strategy to deal with that directly?
Yes. And it was probably the single most effective move in domesticating the holiday. It was the deliberate invention and promotion of trick-or-treat.
Wait, invention? I always thought trick-or-treating just sort of happened organically.
Well, the roots might be older, maybe linked to things like souling in Europe, but the specific ritual of trick-or-treat as we know it, our sources are pretty clear. It was consciously pushed, starting in the 1920s and 30s, by civic groups and community leaders specifically as a way to stop the Halloween pranking.
How did that work?
Think about it. It's basically a form of friendly extortion, right? The implied threat of the trick, the vandalism, is channeled into a harmless, controlled exchange. The treat, the candy. Kids get a payoff. Homeowners avoid getting their windows soaked or worse. It brilliantly redirected that chaotic energy.
So it took the wild, sort of medieval, carnivalesque spirit of the holiday and basically bribed it into submission with candy.
That's a pretty good summary, yeah. It successfully domesticated the rowdy folk holiday, commercialized its threat, and made it palatable for mainstream middle-class society.
So the genius of the progressive approach was secularizing the old Puritan demand for order. Puritans saw disorder as sin. Progressives saw it as bad civic policy, bad for property values.
Exactly right. And the consequence changed too. The Puritans prosecuted you for celebrating at all. The progressives generally prosecuted you for celebrating wrongly for going too far with the pranks.
Was that threat of arrest real?
Oh, yeah. We found references, like a book from 1905, that casually mentions boys could play minor tricks without danger of being pinched, meaning arrested. But it implies that if the pranks got serious, if property was really damaged, arrest and prosecution for vandalism were definitely on the table. It was about maintaining public order enforced by the police. Okay, now we jump to the late 20th century, and this is where the opposition leads to some of its most, frankly, devastating consequences. That old duality we saw with the Puritans, the spiritual danger versus the civic disorder, it kind of comes roaring back, but splits into two huge overlapping moral panics.
The first one is probably the one most people remember, at least vaguely, the panic about innocence at risk.
Right. This was deeply fueled by rising public anxiety about crime, especially urban crime, and the new visibility of things like missing children posters on milk cartons. It created this culture of fear.
And the lightning rod for that fear became poisoned Halloween candy.
Exactly, the urban legend. Razors and apples, poison in pixie sticks. It became this widespread belief, even though study after study showed it was almost entirely a myth. The vast majority of reported cases were hoaxes, often kids pranking their own parents, or sadly, internal family issues.
But it felt real to people. Why did it gain so much traction if it wasn't actually happening on a large scale?
Two specific, highly publicized, and deeply disturbing events really cemented the fear. They made the myth seem plausible, even likely.
The first was in 1974, right? The Timothy O'Brien case in Texas.
Yes, absolutely horrific. The boy's own father, Ronald Clark O'Brien, poisoned him with cyanide-laced pixie sticks to collect life insurance money.
And he gave poison candy to other kids, too, to make it look random.
Did, to create this smoke screen of a random maniac poisoning trick-or-treaters. It was an isolated case of familial murder, incredibly tragic, but the media coverage and public perception framed it as proof positive of the stranger danger threat on Halloween.
And then, 8 years later, something completely unrelated happens that pours gasoline on the fire.
So the 1982 Tylenol murders in Chicago. 7 people died after taking cyanide-laced capsules. Now, this had nothing to do with Halloween. It was product tampering on store shelves.
But it amplified that general fear, the idea that everyday things could be contaminated by unseen, malicious people.
Hugely. It created this background hum of anxiety about random poisoning. So when Halloween came around, that existing fear just latched on to the candy myth. The combination was potent.
And the consequence, what did this fear actually do to the holiday?
It led to a massive de facto opposition to traditional trick-or-treating. It pretty much killed the tradition of giving out homemade treats like cookies or popcorn balls overnight. Nobody trusted them anymore.
And it pushed people towards organized, safe events.
Absolutely. You saw schools, community centers, churches starting to host Halloween parties as alternatives. And this is where you see the birth of the trunk-or-treat phenomenon.
Right. Decorating car trunks in a parking lot.
Exactly. It starts popping up in the 1990s, often organized by churches initially, but promoted primarily as a secularly justified safety measure. It was pitched as a safe substitute for going door to door, controlled environment, known people, prepackaged candy. It directly addressed the poisoned candy fear.
Okay, so that's the social fear, the safety panic. But you said there were 2 panics. What was the other one?
The other was, in many ways, far more damaging and led to far more severe consequences. This was the moral legal panic, the satanic ritual abuse panic, or SRA, mainly in the 1980s.
This was huge, wasn't it? Like widespread accusations.
It was an epidemic of paranoia. We're talking over 12,000 unsubstantiated cases reported across the country. It was this perfect storm of cultural forces converging.
What forces were those?
You had the rise of the politically powerful religious right, deeply concerned about secularism and perceived moral decay. You had the anti-cult movement becoming more professionalized and vocal. And crucially, you had the popularization and subsequent misuse of repressed memory therapy, often fueled by sensationalist books like Michelle Remembers.
And this movement specifically targeted Halloween. This is where that intellectual time bomb from the 19th century goes off.
It absolutely detonates here, yes, because opponents, including very influential televangelists and newly formed parents groups concerned about occult influences, explicitly identified Halloween as the devil's holiday.
Using that old, flawed argument about pagan origins.
Yes, they took that 19th century myth about Samhain and fused it with the current anxieties about child abuse and stranger danger. They started circulating these completely baseless claims about covens performing human sacrifices on October 31st, needing to kidnap children for their rituals. It was terrifying stuff.
And unlike the candy panic, which mostly changed behavior, this SRA panic led to actual legal persecution, didn't it? This is where the consequences become really severe.
Horrifically severe. We saw what amounted to modern day witch trials fueled by mass hysteria. The most infamous case, the one that really symbolizes the whole era, was the McMartin preschool trial in California.
That went on for years, right?
From 1983 to 1990. It became the longest and most expensive criminal trial in American history up to that point. The preschool staff faced hundreds of charges of the most bizarre and lurid acts of satanic ritual abuse, sacrificing animals, drinking blood, taking kids on secret trips to Devilland.
And the evidence came from?
From interviews with the children, conducted using highly suggestive techniques, leading questions, even unorthodox props like anatomically detailed dolls, which experts later agreed were deeply flawed and likely induced false memories or confabulations.
And the result of this massive trial.
0 convictions, not a single one. But the lives and reputations of the accused were utterly destroyed. The financial cost was enormous, and the cultural damage, the way it validated the panic for a time, was immense.
And McMartin wasn't the only case. People actually went to prison based on these kinds of accusations elsewhere.
Tragically, yes.
Yeah.
We have to remember people like Dan and Fran Keller in Austin, Texas. They ran a small home daycare.
What were they accused of?
Similarly outlandish things: serving blood-laced Kool-Aid, cutting up bodies with chainsaws during nap time. Accusations extracted using the same kinds of flawed interview techniques.
And they were convicted.
They were, and they spent 22 years in prison. 22 years. Their convictions were finally overturned in 2015, largely because the methods used to get the original testimony were discredited, but they lost decades of their lives.
22 years.
Mm.
Based on blood-laced Kool-Aid. It just shows the unbelievable power that cultural opposition, that specific fear, had in the legal system at that moment.
It really does, and it highlights a crucial point. While nobody was actually prosecuted for the act of trick-or-treating itself, the broader cultural and political opposition that successfully branded Halloween and anything associated with it as satanic or dangerous, that opposition directly fueled the atmosphere of hysteria. It created the conditions where these miscarriages of justice, affecting hundreds of innocent people, daycare workers, parents, teachers, could happen.
So let's bring trunk or treat back into this. How did the SRA panic influence that?
Ugh, this is where it gets really interesting politically. Remember how trunk or treat started primarily as a secular response to the poisoned candy fear?
Right. About physical safety.
Well, churches and religious groups who had already disliked Halloween for theological reasons, seeing it as pagan or demonic, quickly realized they could use the safety argument to achieve their religious goals. Meaning they could promote trunk or treat or similar harvest festival events held at the church, not by saying Halloween is evil, which may alienate some people, but by saying this is a safe alternative for your kids.
So they co-opted the secular safety panic.
Exactly. It allowed them to effectively pull children out of the traditional neighborhood trick-or-treating, which they viewed as spiritually suspect, under the much more publicly acceptable, universally appealing banner of child safety and family fun. It was a very shrewd move. Okay, so as we move out of the intense panic of the 80s and 90s and into the 21st century, the nature of the fight over Halloween shifts again. The battlefield really narrows. It becomes almost entirely focused on one thing: the holiday's historical origins.
The justification for opposing it now seems to depend entirely on which version of history you believe. It's become a historical debate as a proxy for a cultural war.
That's exactly it. It's a political proxy war fought on the terrain of history. You need that historical justification now.
So what's the main story opponents use today? The narrative they rely on?
That's narrative 1, the pagan origin story. This is the one pushed by many conservative religious groups, like the American Family Association, for example.
And what's the claim?
The claim is that Halloween is a direct, unbroken continuation of an ancient Celtic pagan festival called Samhain, which they usually define as a specific religious ritual involving contacting the dead, warding off evil spirits, maybe even sacrifice.
And if you accept that premise,
Then the conclusion follows easily. Halloween is inherently pagan, therefore, it's linked to the prince of the world and the darkness he continually spreads, as one group put it. That provides the clear theological basis for condemning it and urging Christians not to participate.
Okay, so that's the opposition's historical case. What's the counter narrative? How do people defend the holiday?
That's narrative two, the Christian origins view. This is often put forward by Catholics, but also some mainline or liberal Protestants. They argue no, the holiday didn't start with pagans. It started independently within the church as All Hallows Eve, the vigil night before the Feast of All Saints on November 1st.
And the costumes going door to door.
They argue those customs either developed separately or were originally Christian. For example, they might link trick or treating to the medieval practice of souling, where poor people would go door to door on All Souls' Day offering prayers for the dead in exchange for food or money. Jack o' lanterns might be seen as symbols of souls in purgatory or ways to ward off evil in a Christian context. Basically, they try to reclaim the holiday symbols as Christian, or at least neutral folk customs.
Okay, so we have these two competing historical narratives, both used politically today. What does actual academic history say? What's the scholarly consensus on Halloween's origins?
Well, the consensus among most historians who specialize in this area, largely influenced by the meticulous research of historian Ronald Hutton in the UK, really throws cold water on narrative one, the direct pagan lineage story.
Hutton's work is considered pretty definitive.
It's highly respected, yes. He went back and systematically examined the actual medieval sources, the archaeological evidence, everything. And his findings really challenged the neat story the pagan origins proponents tell.
Okay, so what are some of the key debunking points from Hutton and others?
There are several big ones. First, the idea of Samhain being this huge, unified pan Celtic festival, specifically focused on the dead and spirits in the way it's often portrayed. Hutton found very little evidence for that in early medieval records. He argues that celebration was more varied, more regional, often more focused on the end of the harvest and preparing for winter.
So, not necessarily a big spooky ghost festival everywhere.
Probably not in the way it's imagined today. Second, that key claim that the popes Gregory III and Gregory V in the 8th and 9th centuries deliberately moved the Christian feast of All Saints from May to November 1st in order to co-opt or suppress Samhain.
Yeah, you hear that all the time.
Hutton found no contemporary evidence for that motive. There's no record suggesting the popes in Rome were even particularly aware of, let alone trying to strategically counter a specific regional Celtic festival like Samhain when they made the change. The reasons were likely more complex, possibly tied to logistics in Rome or influences from German churches.
Okay, so the Christian takeover narrative is shaky. What about the customs themselves? The costumes, the pranks?
This is crucial. Hutton's research shows that almost all the customs we strongly associate with Halloween today, wearing costumes, playing pranks, specific games like apple bobbing, even carving jack-o'-lanterns, appear in the historical record relatively late, mostly 18th and 19th centuries, primarily in Ireland and Britain.
So, centuries after any supposed ancient pagan Samhain festival.
Exactly. There's virtually no demonstrable link connecting these modern folk customs back to ancient Celtic pagan religious practices. They seem to be largely modern developments.
Wow. So, if Hutton and the consensus are right, the conclusion is pretty stark, isn't it?
It is. It means that the entire justification for the modern religious opposition to Halloween, the argument that it's inherently pagan and demonic because it comes from Samhain, is based on fighting a ghost. They're fighting a 19th century historical falsehood, a romantic myth created by folklorists, not an actual ancient pagan cult.
But that myth, however inaccurate, serves a powerful political purpose today.
Immensely powerful. It's the intellectual foundation, the justification for drawing that line in the sand in the modern culture war over the holiday, even if the history itself doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
Okay, that brings us right up to the present day. The opposition certainly hasn't gone away, but it seems more complicated now, like it's coming from different directions at once.
That's a perfect way to describe it. Our sources suggest thinking about it as a kind of pincer movement, or maybe even a trifurcated opposition coming from three distinct and often contradictory sources or fronts.
All right, let's break those down. What's front number one?
Front one is the ongoing culture war, waged primarily by the religious right. This is the direct legacy of the Satanic Panic era, though maybe dialed back a bit in intensity.
So the opponents are still largely conservative, evangelical groups, religious broadcasters, political organizations associated with them?
Yes, And their justification hasn't really changed. It's still explicitly theological, still based entirely on that pagan origins premise we just discussed, even if it's historically flawed.
So they condemn it as demonic, warn about fellowship with darkness, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And their form of opposition today usually involves two main tactics. One is promoting internal alternatives within their own communities, pushing Reformation Day celebrations on October 31st, or rebranding church events as harvest festivals or trunk or treats, explicitly positioned as godly substitutes.
And the other tactic.
Sometimes more direct public confrontation. You hear reports of groups protesting or trying to evangelize at public pagan gatherings, like the Witches' Market in Salem, Massachusetts, trying to draw that clear boundary against perceived spiritual darkness.
Okay, so that's the familiar religious opposition. What's front number two? This one feels newer.
Front two is fascinating because it comes from a completely different place. This is secular policy and inclusivity concerns, primarily emanating from public school administrators, school boards, and sometimes other government bodies.
And crucially, their reasons for opposing or restricting Halloween in schools have nothing to do with religion or paganism.
Nothing at all. Their justification is entirely secular, generally progressive leaning, and driven by policy concerns. They aren't worried about the devil, they're worried about lawsuits and social harmony.
So, what specific problems do they cite? Why ban costumes or parades?
It usually boils down to a few key arguments, according to the sources. First, inclusivity and equity. They argue that Halloween celebrations, especially costume days, can be exclusive or unwelcoming to students from diverse backgrounds.
Like students whose religions prohibit celebrating holidays.
Exactly. Like Jehovah's Witnesses, some Muslim students, potentially others, participating might violate their religious beliefs, and not participating can lead to them feeling excluded or singled out.
Okay, what else besides religious inclusion?
The second big one is the financial burden and socioeconomic equity. Costumes cost money. For families struggling financially, buying a costume might be impossible, leading to kids feeling left out, embarrassed, or even facing mocking or bullying if they come without one or with a homemade one. It creates an equity issue within the school.
And is there a legal angle too?
Yes, that's the third point. Schools want to avoid First Amendment problems. They worry that by endorsing or organizing Halloween activities, which some people do view as religious, whether pagan or Christian, they could be seen as violating the separation of church and state, leading to potential legal challenges.
So, purely practical secular policy reasons.
Mm.
And the form this opposition takes is
Usually, outright policy bans on costumes or Halloween parties. One poll mentioned found that something like 41% of school leaders reported restricting Halloween celebrations in some way. Or, very commonly, they engage in rebranding.
rebranding.
Yeah, they keep the idea of a fun fall event, but strip out anything specifically Halloween related. So it becomes a generic fall festival or maybe a book character day where kids dress up as literary figures, or even something completely neutral like Crazy Sock Day.
It keeps the fun but removes the controversy.
Precisely. It allows the school to have a seasonal activity without the religious, financial, or legal baggage associated with Halloween itself.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting politically. Let's connect front one and front two.
Yes, the irony is incredible. You have the religious right, front one, wanting to get rid of Halloween in public spaces because they see it as ungodly. And you have secular school administrators, front two, wanting to get rid of Halloween in public schools because they see it as inequitable or legally risky.
But they're both pushing towards the exact same practical outcome.
Exactly. Both groups, for completely opposite reasons, are effectively working to remove the specific cultural traditions of Halloween from the public square and replace them with a generic fall festival.
One using the language of piety, the other using the language of social justice and policy.
It's a fascinating paradox. These ideologically opposed groups end up as unwitting allies in the cultural sanitation of the holiday. The end result is the same: tighter control, less specific tradition.
Okay, so religious right, secular schools. What's the third front of opposition today?
Front three is municipal legal and public safety. And this one feels like a direct echo, almost a revival, of the progressive era concerns from 100 years ago.
Back to worrying about vandalism and disorder.
Absolutely. The justification here is purely about maintaining public safety, preventing property damage, and controlling potentially rowdy teens on Halloween night. It's the police chief's and the city manager's perspective.
And this is where we see actual laws and ordinances being passed today. This is modern prosecution.
Yes, very specific municipal laws. So the ones that get the most attention are the age limits on trick or treating.
Right. Towns passing laws saying kids over 12 or 14 or 16 can't go trick or treating.
Exactly. And these aren't just suggestions, they often carry misdemeanor charges or fines. Chesapeake, Virginia became famous for threatening actual jail time for teens caught trick or treating, though they later reduced it to a hefty $250 fine after public outcry. But it shows how seriously some places take it.
What other kinds of local laws?
You also see Halloween specific curfews for minors, sometimes kicking in quite early, like 8 p.m. And another category targets registered persons laws, specifically prohibiting registered sex offenders from participating in Halloween in any way. No decorations, no costumes, no answering the door.
That directly addresses that stranger danger fear left over from the panics.
It does. It legally codifies that anxiety.
Now, are these laws, especially the age limits, facing any pushback?
Yes, there are critics. Some legal commentators argue these age limit laws are potentially unconstitutional, that they're overly broad and might violate the First Amendment.
How so?
The argument is that wearing a costume can be considered a form of symbolic speech, which is protected. Banning teens from wearing costumes just because they're trick or treating could be seen as infringing on that right. So the legal battles, the push and pull over control continue even today. Hashtag tag outro.
You know, when you step back and look at this whole 400-year arc, the opposition to Halloween really does act like this incredible mirror, reflecting whatever America was most anxious about at the time. Yeah, you can trace the fears, colonial era, fear of God going astray, fear for communal purity.
Then the progressive era. Fear of social disorder, fear for private property in the new cities.
Mid to late 20th century, fear for child safety, fear of hidden evils, both secular and supernatural.
And now, today, it's this complex mix. Fear of religious otherness or demons for some, fear of social inequity or legal trouble for others, and that persistent fear of teenage disorder for local authorities. The fears just keep shape-shifting.
And yet, despite all of this, the bans, the fines, the panics, the rebranding the holiday itself somehow endures. It's remarkably resilient. Why do you think that is? Why does it keep surviving these attacks?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think, as some of our sources hint, the key might be in its fundamental nature as a carnivalesque event.
Carnivalesque, meaning?
Meaning, it's one of those rare moments in the calendar, maybe the only one left for many people, where the normal rules get temporarily suspended, where social hierarchies flip, kids demand things from adults, people put on masks and become someone else for a night, where authority relaxes just a little bit.
So the Halloween problem isn't really about Halloween itself.
It's arguably always been about the anxiety of authority, whether that authority is a Puritan elder, a worried police chief, a school principal, or even a nervous parent when faced with the temporary loss of control, the brief suspension of normal order that the holiday represents.
That makes a lot of sense. Which leads to a final thought, maybe something for you, the listener, to chew on. We've seen how the holiday has been successfully tamed in many ways by corporations making it commercial, by the safety panic changing how we do it, and now by these municipal laws restricting ages and school policies, erasing its specific identity. So the provocative question is, are these modern moves, the age limits, the school bans, driven by these very different political logics, are they the final steps in completely stripping away that last bit of original, messy, anarchic, carnivalesque spirit? Are we replacing that playful, temporary chaos with absolute, seamless order?
And if we do succeed in eliminating that last vestige of controlled anarchy, that one night where things get a little weird, what does that mean for us? What happens to a society when it loses even its managed safety valves for letting off steam and briefly challenging the norm? Something to think about next time October 31st rolls around.
Definitely something to think about. That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.